Okay, there we go.
I learned that Chris was also in finance in New York for a short period of time, but discovered that the world of ideas was much more attractive. So apparently one can be paid in ideas. And we're working on putting a dollar value on that, and that will be our raise for next year. So we're very pleased to have with us on the 201st anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln, a discussion of democracy and elections for school boards. So here's Chris Berry.
All right, well, so thanks for inviting me down. I appreciate it. It's my first trip to Arkansas, and it's been a pleasure thus far. Hopefully I'll still be able to say that when I leave in a couple hours. And thank you all for turning out for the talk. So this is a talk about election timing and interest group influence in school board politics, and so it's very well titled. I should tell you that my co-author is Jake Gerson, who's also at the University of Chicago. He's in the law school. In the paper, we have we do a bit of legal analysis here. I'm not going to do so much of that in the talk today for the purposes of this audience, but we are interested in sort of the school board law and the law of election timing. So part of the motivation for this talk is that accountability is sort of a big buzzword in education these days, and you often hear people talk about it as if it's a new idea. And in fact, it's not. Accountability is something we've had in education from day one, back to Abe Lincoln's day, I guess. And has come in the form of what might be called democratic accountability. We have elections, just like the same way we hold any other branch of government accountable. We have an election. If we don't like what's happened, we elect new people. And in this regards, school districts are very much like any other government, and this graph just is sort of tabulating the number of elected officials in the United States, which it may surprise you to learn are about 500,000. This is as of '92, the most recent year this survey was conducted. Obviously, we're familiar with the federal government offices, the 435 members of the House, 100 in the Senate, President, Vice President, and so forth. 18,000 elected officials in state governments. All local governments combined are getting around nearly 500,000 there. And amongst them, school districts, got about 90,000 elected officials operating them. And this is sort of, in our view at least, the bedrock of what we call democratic accountability in education, your local school board. Now, the traditional view of how this works, we might call the school board, or the schoolhouse rock view, which is people go to the polls on a periodic basis. They kind of observe how their school district, or whatever the relevant government is, they observe how it's been doing for the past few years. They go to the polls. They vote the people in or out again based on their satisfaction with the performance of the relevant, of the government in question. They all go home, and we come back again 4 years later and go through the whole process again. Now, what wouldn't be clear from sort of the schoolhouse rock view of the world is that these poor people down here in the corner are going to be very, very tired, because we have many, many, many elections in the United States, and they don't just happen, every 4th November when we're electing the president. They happen almost constantly. And here's an example from Nassau County in New York, and just to give you some statistics here. In this county, there's one special district election every 11 working days. There is at least one election in each of 11 different months, 26 different special district and village election days. I might point out, none of them on the same day as the general election in November. So I had thought that this was maybe one of the worst examples in the country, and then I've been reading some more about how things are done in Dallas and other parts of Texas, and they've got it, from what I can tell, even worse, and they're passing some laws to consolidate elections there. So in any event, huge variation in the timing of elections, the extent to which the various offices are fragmented. And the basic question of this paper, research in the area, is, does it matter? Now, it'd be a pretty boring paper if the answer was no. Unsurprisingly, yes, we're going to tell you that it matters. Now, how does it matter? It matters for turnout. This is not especially surprising. Turnout is much lower in elections that are held at odd times. I'll have a lot more to say about that. That's not particularly novel, although I think we have some particularly good evidence of effective election timing on turnout. This leads to a phenomenon we call selective participation, and I'll elaborate on that in a few minutes, but we mean essentially that when elections are held at odd times and turnout is very low, the people who turn out in those elections are not sort of a random or representative sample of the general public. And this is going to lead to concrete policy differences in the governments that are subject to different election timing regimes. That will be our argument. Now, to the extent that there is any kind of academic literature on this question, it deals primarily with the relationship between election timing and turnout, not policy per se, but turnout. So, a few facts that are pretty well known in political science. Turnout is lower in what we call off-cycle elections, which is just to say if you look at turnout for congressional races, that turnout is much higher in the year when there's a presidential election than in the midterm year, maybe a 20 percentage point differential in turnout. That's pretty well established. Turnout is lower in local elections than national elections, even if they were held at the same time. Turnout, even among local elections, is lower in special district elections or any other kind of special purpose election. And of course, turnout is lower when elections do not piggyback on general elections. So this is about what we know about turnout. Now, one response to these facts about turnout is, who cares? It shouldn't matter much. And there's, in fact, a pretty big political science literature making the following argument. Yes, we realize that turnout, even in presidential elections, is usually only around 50 or 60%. But that in itself doesn't really matter for outcomes of elections because the people who turn out are fairly representative of the whole population. And so even if everyone voted and we had 100% turnout, the outcomes of the races wouldn't change, and therefore we shouldn't really be particularly concerned with the aggregate level of turnout. I'm not going to really go into detail or evaluate that claim, but I will say it is a prominent view in political science, and many people, including fairly prominent political scientists, have studied this problem and made such an argument. If this were true, that is, if it were true that people who vote are representative of the whole population of potential voters, then this whole phenomenon I'm talking about would be completely unimportant. In fact, we might find it desirable to have low turnout because turnout is costly, and if the 10% of people who vote more or less represent the rest of us, then the other 90% of us can go off and go to work and get things done. Second view, which says who cares about election timing, is what we might call the Thibault view, or what we call local government competition view. This is a view, so the first view I told you, the who cares view, is more of a political science view. The second is more of an economics view. And this view basically says governments are competing with each other, whether it be school districts, city, whatever kind of local government you're talking about. They're all in competition with one another. And it's this competition or the threat, the ability of people to move, that's what keeps government efficient. This is called voting with your feet. And if you believe in voting with your feet, which you can do anytime, not every 4 years, not on any given day, but anytime you like, and if it's voting with your feet that really matters, voting at the ballot box isn't particularly important. Variation in political institutions, whether election timing or any other political institution you could think of, shouldn't be especially important, because if one was better than another, competition would lead the governments to choose the best one. And so if a particular regime of timing, holding it on this day or that day, was better than some other one, governments, in the course of competing with each other, trying to keep residents and track new capital and whatnot, they would settle on what's the best one. And to the extent that we observe any variation left, it shouldn't matter. This would be true, unless, of course, the timing of the elections itself is one of the ways by which the jurisdictions compete. And I'll say more about that later. But okay, so here's two views that basically say we shouldn't be worried too much about this timing business at all. We put forth a different view. We call it selective participation. So without trying to we don't try to get fully into the black box of voter decision making and say, for those of you who know this literature, it's a very deep problem. And the problem that most sort of people, political scientists and economists are concerned with is not the question of why don't people vote, but the puzzle of why anyone does vote, given that the probability of your vote affecting the outcome is basically zero. We don't get into that issue. We're going to put that aside. We're not going to try to open that black box. What we're going to say is this. There are some costs of voting, some potential benefits of voting. For any given electoral scheme, there's going to be somebody at the margin, somebody who's basically indifferent about voting or not. The costs are roughly equal to what they perceive the benefits to be. If you raise those costs, those people who are on the margin are going to stop voting. If you were to lower them, you'll induce into the election a bunch of people who might not have been voting before. This movement of people into and out of the electorate as a result of changing the cost of voting is, again, not going to be random. The people who care the most are going to be the ones most willing to bear high costs of voting and turnout. The people who care the least are going to be the ones that are going to be most easily deterred when you make voting more costly to stay home. So what this means is that the median voter, which we'll call the actual median, but the median voter, the median person who comes to the polls, is going to change when you raise or lower the cost of voting, such that the more costly it is to vote, the distribution of people who actually turn out are going to be those that care the most about the issue at stake, and the median voter will therefore represent that view. And the cheaper it is, or cheaper in a general sense, time, effort, however you want to look at it, the cheaper it is, you're going to get more and more people, such that in principle, if it were completely costless to vote, everyone would vote, and the median voter, the median actual voter would be the same as the median in the population. I'm being a little bit loose here. I have a book recently, a slightly different context, where I've got a formalization of this, but let's not go into it, because the intuition, I think, is pretty simple. Basic idea, of course, is when it's costly to vote, when you've got elections held at weird times, you're going to get special interest voters who are going to disproportionately be represented in the electorate. I want to say at the beginning, and be very clear about this, that we're making a positive argument, not a normative argument. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about special interest influence in elections, now, in everyday discourse about politics in this country, we tend to say, when we say special district, that tends to have special interest, that tends to have a pejorative a connotation to it. Special interest groups are somehow bad. We don't make any claims about that whatsoever. We have a theory that says when it becomes more costly to vote, special interest groups will become more influential because they'll be the ones who continue to vote. Whether that's good or bad, substantively for policy, we do not take a position on that. And it's a somewhat difficult problem, and it's a familiar one. On the one hand, you could say, special interest groups, they come out more to the polls, they dominate the elections. That could be bad, because they may, by definition of being a special interest group, they care more about this thing than everyone else. They may care about other things, policy outcomes that the rest of us don't, and they may steer policy in a direction that the rest of the population wouldn't, and that could be bad. On the other hand, it may be that these special interest groups are in fact experts in the thing that we're deciding about, and they may know more than the rest of us. And so when they come and dominate the elections, we could get better outcomes, because they know a lot more about the thing that's being voted on. Could go either way. It's an empirical question, and we're not making a judgment, a value judgment about whether special interest influence in school board elections or any other is a good or a bad thing. We'll have something to say about it empirically a little bit later. Now, to give you just an example of the sort of phenomenon we have in mind when we talk about selective participation, this is just Terry Moe, who I understand is coming out here at some point in the near future, had a paper not long ago where he looked at voting by members of teacher unions in California, and he found the following thing. So turnout for registered voters in school district elections is about 9%, so it's pretty low. Teachers are between 2 and 7 times more likely to vote in the elections than the other registered voters. Now, one thing you might think is, and he talks about in this paper, well, maybe they're just more civic-minded. Teachers care about education, it's their job, and so they vote not because they are trying to influence the particular policies related to their pay and whatnot, but they just care about education. In order to get at that question, what he looks at is teachers who live and work in the same district versus teachers who live and work in different districts. If it was just the case that teachers are sort of very civic-minded, you'd think they'd be very likely to vote in school board elections whether they lived in that district or they didn't. And if it was more because they were trying to influence policies that might affect their own sort of occupational well-being, they would vote more in their own district as opposed to when they lived in a different one. So what he finds, first of all, is that teachers are more likely to vote even if they don't work in the district where they live. So there is an aspect of this just generally caring more about education. So that 14% number is compared to the 9. So they're notably more likely to vote even if they don't work in the district. But if they do live and work in the district, the effect is huge. So it's 35%, so 3.5 times more likely to vote, which suggests there's something about their occupational interest as apart from just a general caring about education that's driving this. This is just an example. I want to give you the phenomenon I'm talking about. Now, if election timing, the time in which local elections are held, just kind of fell from the sky, then we might not care much about it, but we begin to care especially when we recognize that in many instances, the governments themselves, whether it be a school district or any other kind, they get to choose the time of election. This is, to some extent, giving them the ability to choose the median voter in the election. And we liken this in the paper to controversies over redistricting. Members of Congress draw districts, and there are big concerns about the way in which redistricting is done to advantage incumbents. We try to draw a district such that the current incumbent will have a very strong chance of being reelected. At least the accusation is that these are what people in state legislatures and the Congress do. And then effectively they're trying to draw boundaries of a district that will result in a particular median voter being chosen who will support the incumbent. The choice, we say, of election timing is like that choice, though not as stark, in the sense that choosing the time of the election doesn't prohibit any particular person from coming out to vote. It just makes it more or less costly for them to do so. By the way, one story, we mentioned that the politicians can choose the dates and places of the elections, and one of my favorite examples of this, which I won't say more about in this, is that, so in Colorado, most fire services are operated by fire districts, an independent fire government. And when they hold a referendum to pass a bond for new equipment or capital investment for the fire district, the polling places are all in the firehouses. So there will be, all of them are in firehouses. So we're not really in this paper focused on choosing the location, we're more in choosing the time, but there's a paper to be written about choice of location of polling places as well. I don't know, in school districts, if there's ever a polling place outside of a school or not, I don't know. Okay, so and then there's some literature on this with respect to school bond referenda. A couple papers that have studied this, and they find that school districts systematically avoid holding bond elections in November or elections when we expect there to be very large turnout when there's, say, a presidential election, and they intentionally hold them in sort of off-cycle elections or oddly timed elections when we expect turnout to be lower, and that the bond referenda are more likely to be approved the lower the turnout. And this is this Dunn, Reed, and Wilbanks paper that we refer to is really a great and I think underappreciated paper that talks about this phenomenon. And there's actually an industry of sort of election timing consultants, and they work with not just school districts but any kind of local government that may be planning a bond referendum of some sort, and they consult with them about it's a legitimate line of consulting. How do you pass the referendum and the various things you want to do? But one of them includes strategically timing the election itself. Okay. So as I said, the existing literature is pretty good on turnout. We know how election timing affects turnout. We don't really know much about how election timing affects any kind of actual outcomes. To the extent that there is a literature on this, it tends to be cross-sectional, meaning we look at some sort of government that has an even year election and a different one that has an odd year election. We can look at differences between them. We can try to control for, in a statistical sense, control for observable things that differ between them. This is a tough problem, though. And by the way, I should say I have a student, a former student, who's done a paper kind of like this across more states and trying to control for observables. A potential problem here is that we know there are differences between, in the case I'm going to talk about today, school districts that have even year elections versus odd year elections. They're not randomly different. The bigger cities, more urban areas, tend to be more likely to have an off-cycle election, and the sort of suburban areas are more likely to have an on-cycle election. There are a variety of historical reasons for this that we could talk about. Some of it has to do with the progressive movement, where one of the strategies for trying to undermine urban machines was to sort of fragment the elections and pull some specialized elections into different parts of the calendar. They thought, for reasons that I think retrospectively don't seem that good, but they thought that might undermine the ability of the machine to control the elections. It's also the case that the more densely populated the place is, the more governments and elections they have, the more likely they can spin things off in a cost-effective fashion. I'll come back to this, but all of this is just to say it's a problem that the districts differ in these ways, such that you wouldn't necessarily want to just run a regression where you put even year or odd year election on the right-hand side and see what the differences are. I'm going to do that, but you wouldn't necessarily want to just do that. And so what am I going to do? We're going to take advantage of what we call here a quasi-experiment. Probably a simpler way to say it would just be an exogenous change in the law. The law exogenous from the perspective of any given individual school district in California in the 80s. Prior to 1986, all school districts in California by law held their elections in odd years, which is to say off cycle. They were not coterminous with any major race. So all the major president, Congress, governor, senator, they're all on cycle, and so they were holding their elections in this odd time. In 1986, the legislature passed a law that said basically removed this requirement. Districts used to be required to hold them on off cycle. It removed that requirement so you can move them to on cycle if you want, consolidate them with other elections. And by 2006, which is the most recent year of data we have so far, about 2/3 of districts had made that shift. Everything we can find, both in the debate over the bill in the state legislature and the individual decisions of districts, these were motivated by cost savings, just the electoral administration costs. For a variety of reasons, well, it's not important, but school districts were going to end up paying, if they didn't change, we're going to end up paying a much larger fraction of the costs of holding their elections. What this does is it gives us the opportunity to observe within district variation in both turnout and policy outcomes. Now, within district, what I mean is we can observe the same district when it had off-cycle elections and on-cycle elections, and we can ask, how did these outcomes change when the election regime changed? This is going to give us some advantage over just comparing districts that happen to have odd or on-year elections where they're just different districts that might be different in other reasons. We're going to talk about the same district observed at different times under different electoral regime, and we're going to ask, are there differences in turnout and in policy? For turnout, I should say, we're going to be looking at turnout here as the votes cast divided by the voting age population. I know there's some political scientists in the room, so I'm not going to go into the inside baseball talk here, but what that means is when you have ballot roll-off, you can have different turnout for different races held on the same day. But I'm going to use the term turnout, loosely speaking. And then we have two outcomes, which are going to be teacher salaries and test scores, and I'll talk about those, obviously. Okay, so our data come from California Elections Data Archive, and wherein we have candidates, elections, ballot designations for thousands, 11,000 elections from 96 to 2006. One thing I want to note right away is you'll see that the change in the law came in 86. So the legislature passed this law in 86, which means a school district, if they were going to change the timing of their regime, the first year in which we could see that would be in 88. So if they didn't change, their next election would be in 87. If they did change, it would be in 88 and so forth. What this means is we don't actually get to start observing the data on this election timing until 96, so there's this gap. Just bear that in mind. I'm going to come back and talk about a variety of different ways we're going to deal with that, but what it means is I observe in 96 whether you're an even year or odd year district, but I don't know exactly when you made the switch necessarily. If you might have made it in 88, 90, 92. Okay, so as I said, we've got about 11,000 elections. 4,000 of them are school district elections, 3,300 are municipal elections, and then the rest are sort of a smattering of things like community colleges and county offices of one kind or another. We're also going to get and match salary data from the state of California, and we're going to, well, I'll say more about the salary data in a bit. I'll start with the elections data. Okay. So what the methods we're going to do, first I'm going to do the thing I just said you should be worried about doing, which is run a regression where you just put election timing on the right-hand side and see what's different. I'm going to do that as sort of a benchmark in which I can then compare the estimates I'm going to get using this fixed effect strategy, or the strategy of looking within district over time at the same district changing. So I want to be able to compare, well, what would I get from what you might call the naive approach or the cross-sectional approach relative to this within district more differences type of approach. Of course, we are going to control for the covariates about the jurisdiction that we know, and I'll show you more in a table, but things like population size and the race and home ownership and that sort of thing. Okay, so first just to look at the descriptive statistics, this is the point I was making, which is pretty stark here. Well, you can see, this is a year-by-year total, but what we've got is the average and median turnout by district, the number of elections held each year, and then the average turnout. And all I want to show you is that in even years, turnout is about double what it is in odd years. About 20 percentage points difference, which is about 100%. So this is a big difference. Just to show this graphically here, again, this are the years, and this is the turnout. The dotted lines are the school districts, and this is just to put in comparison, and the solid lines are municipalities. So a couple of things worth noting. School district election turnout is always lower than municipal turnout. Even if the elections are held at the same time, this means there's this roll-off. So people, they come to the polls, and they may vote for the high top of the ballot offices, but by the time they get down to the bottom, a lot of people have dropped off. So school district turnout is always lower, but it's more the sawtooth pattern I want to draw your attention to here. And you can also notice that the presidential years, even relative to other even years, have this additional bump. Okay. All right, so that's purely descriptive. Just to show you the regression I was talking about, just let me give you the quick overview of the table. The first two here are these OLS miles where I said I'm just going to run and put the right thing on the right-hand side, election timing, and just run it. And then the fixed effects are where I'm going to look within district before and after a change. So nothing surprising here. These numbers are just exactly quantify the numbers I just showed you in the tables and graphs. It's about, odd year elections are about 20 percentage points lower in turnout, which again is about 100%. Even when I do the fixed effects and I look within a jurisdiction, when it changes, the year before and after it changes, same thing. Of course, we're not literally saying that it's the evenness or the oddness of the year that itself is causing turnout. It's obviously the being held coterminously with some major election. And here in the next column, we just quantify that. So we just, rather than having this catch-all sort of odd year indicator, we've got an indicator that was the election day the president was on the ticket, the governor or the senator. And what you can see is that these basically just capture they explain the November dummy, why we're seeing this big. It's basically that you've got the president or the governor. The way it works in California is the president and the governor on every 2 years, one of the two of them will be on the ballot. They're sort of on rotating 4-year schedules. Right? Having a senator on top of this doesn't really get you much. But again, just to be clear, in principle, we can't prove that it's due to the president. Any election that was held on the same 4-year cycle as the president would have the same coding, but it seems pretty obvious that it's the presence of the president. So for the turnout regression itself, it's pretty clear the effect it's having, and that effect is holds within district after the change. Now this itself is pretty important. What it's telling you is that if you change the date of your school board election, you can increase voter participation by about 100%. You can double it. That one simple thing. These are the same results for municipalities. I'm not gonna say much about it. The virtual data. Okay, so election timing effects turnout. Again, we kind of knew that. I think this research design is nice to be able to look within district over time, but there's no surprise that election timing affects turnout. So what we want to ask now is, well, can we relate this to a policy outcome of some kind? Again, we have the selective participation argument, which is to say, it's not only that turnout was double in the on-year versus the off-year, but the people who are voting are different. That additional sort of 20 percentage points of the electorate that comes to the poll in the even year is not just the mirror image of those that were coming in before, it's that you're incorporating these people who were less passionate about the issue, that's why they weren't voting before, but hey, if the president's on the ticket and I'm already there, I'll vote, right? So we want to know, does this affect a policy outcome when you bring in, basically double the electorate by bringing in people who are sort of not the most passionate people. Again, we'll use this what we call a quasi-experiment in the change in the law. So the first thing we're going to look at is teacher salaries. Why that? Well, we have this evidence from the Terry Moe paper I described to you before that teachers are a good example of the selective participation argument we have. They do disproportionately participate. So that's a reasonable interest group to focus on when we talk about special interest group influence. We can also know that salaries are sort of a pretty universal goal. Higher salaries are a pretty universal goal, rightly so, of a teachers union. I mean, that's their job, right, to get the best deal they can for their members. And a nice thing is that the salaries follow a rigid pay scale. Depending on your qualifications and your education, you get a certain. All the teachers with the same sort of qualifications are going to get the same salary. And so what we do is we actually go to the contracts that are negotiated between the district and the teachers union. Okay, and what we do, we get this from the California Department of Education. What we do is we take the whole salary schedule for the district, which is I'm sure many of you are totally familiar with these, but you've got different sort of levels of education and years of experience, and this grid is going to tell you what step that would put you in, and then you get a certain pay for that. And all we're going to do is we're going to and so we know that we look at all the contracts negotiated between the school board and the teachers union across all these years, and within each contract we identify a common step in the salary. We're going to use, I don't think I say it in here, step 10 in the California system, which seems to be a pretty average. This is a teacher with BA and like 60 continuing hours of education or something like that. We kind of poked around and it seems to be what they consider an average teacher. It doesn't really matter. We just want to make sure we're comparing the same similarly qualified teachers across districts when we make this analysis. Okay? We could have chosen any step probably. Okay. So here's going to be a similar idea of regression. So the first, we're just going to run that simple OLS I told you not to run. We want to see what the results would be. This is just basically this is just telling us the difference in average salaries between even year and odd year districts. It's about $1,700 different. Then again, it's still within the OLS framework. We can control for a bunch of stuff about the districts. That reduces the effect somewhat, because I told you there were observable differences between the districts that might lead, big city districts are more likely to have, in the cross-section, are more likely to have the odd year elections. And so they might pay more just because they're big cities or something, right? So controlling for that. Then here we do the within difference. We look at within a district over time, take the contract negotiated when the board was elected under odd years and the contracts negotiated when the board was elected under even years, and look at the difference in the salaries negotiated. And again, we see these two are about the same, given the standard years. They're about the same. So what does that mean? How should we think about it? The average step 10 salary in California is $54,000. Depending on which estimates we're using, it's in the order of 2 to 4% effect. I'll come back towards the end of the talk and say, is that big or small? New. It's not in the paper. May not be on the screen either. Okay, this is just in. So I told you that we had this problem where the law changed in '86. So in principle, if you want to, we could talk about this as being a treatment, that the election time as being a treatment, right? And so in principle, the first year in which a district could have gotten the treatment would be '88. Okay. But we're not observing any outcomes until '96 for the turnout and for '99 for the salary. So we've got this lag. We don't know when they started getting the treatment. We don't know what they looked like before the treatment and so forth. We'd like to know that. So we have, with a bunch of RAs, have been collecting historical. We've gotten all the paper salaries from all the districts going back to '87, which would be the last year, what you could call the baseline year. It's the last year before you could have gotten the treatment. we've been collecting all that. And so now we can, then this is not in the paper because this is what we're working on sort of presently. But what we can do is we can allow us to examine before and after for all the districts. Now note back here, whoops. Okay, that's a little slower than back here in the fixed effects, we can only look at those districts that changed their timing within the period where we had data, so from '99 onward, right? So that's good, but we'd like to have all the districts. So, okay, so what we can do now is we can get the 87 salary for all the districts we have, and we can control for that the pre-treatment values, and then ask after they've made the switch, what is their salary relative to how it was before for all the districts. And here I just did this simple, I put this in logs so we can think about percent changes in a simple way. Again, I like to do this sort of what you call the naive way of doing it, or just comparing stuff, so that we get a sense of whether any of these research design sort of fixed effect stuff is even important. So this is what you get if you just compare. So the dependent variable here is the difference in salary from 87. You can think of it that way. And you're going to find 5%. I'm sorry, the difference in salary, not relative to 87, but just the aggregate difference between even and odd years is about 5%. When we control for the baseline salary, you can see it changes hugely, okay, much smaller. So there is this sort of problem of unobservable differences between the two. And I won't go into the details of the last 3 columns, but they're all basically one where this one, all right, pre-treatment salary, and you can see it's very high correlation there. Then we can also add a bunch of other controls about the district that might have influenced whether the salaries would increase more or less. And then in the last column, I'm just going to convert this to a difference, which is just the dependent variable is going to be the difference between the last year salary, which is 05, and the 87. So we turn that into differences and then regress that. And again, it gives you basically the same result. 2 percentage points. I'm sorry, 2% in salary. And just we can then put that in a graphical depiction as well. This is change in salary from 87 to 2005. These are not inflation adjusted, but it wouldn't be relevant because they're all in California. And what you can see, the odd year districts are the ones we're claiming where there are more special interest influence, have bigger changes, and even your districts have smaller ones. This is just to look at the whole distribution of changes. So these are the difference relative to 87. So again, but in simple terms, the even year districts are increasing their salaries at a significantly slower rate than the odd year districts. Okay. So what I've shown you thus far is that as you know, there's a strain of this literature. This is just yet another example of the nefarious influence of teachers' unions in election policy. That may be true, I don't know. But again, we told you, right, I said initially, there could be offsetting effects, right? If you have, in this case we're talking about teachers, if teachers dominate these elections, right, they certainly have some occupational interests at stake, and by dominating elections, they may be able to tilt things in their favor on that regard. On the other hand, we think that teachers are also experts in this thing, and particularly with respect to their own school board, if things are going badly, what have you, they'd be more likely to know it than the average person. We might, again, and I've only focused on teachers turning out, but presumably the same effect pertains to parents. Parents are a special interest group, as we're defining it, meaning they care more than non-parents about this outcome and more likely to vote. So it may be, yeah, you know, you see this happen, and teachers maybe extract a little bit of benefits, but in the end, you're also getting better policy. I guess all I'm prepared to say, start studying these test scores, the more I know I have to learn about how to model them right. And so I don't know the answer yet. This is part of our ongoing work. Doing simple things like I just showed you, we don't find a difference. And I know there's some people here with more expertise on this than I am, and if there's time in the Q&A, I may just kind of show you what I can use a blackboard, I can show you what I think the problem is that makes this hard, and maybe people will have some suggestions. But we don't see differences in test scores, and we certainly don't see changes within districts in the test scores after they change the election machine. All right, so what threats to identification? What do I mean here? What else? What are the problems with the research design which might mean that you shouldn't believe the results? Well, the most obvious one is we've got a problem of what we call endogenous selection into the treatment, which is the state passed this law that said you can now change your time of your election if you want. Said this to the school districts. About 2/3 of them have done so thus far, but it's a voluntary choice. They chose to have even year odd year elections. Now, in principle, this could bias our results. The story in which the results I was telling you might be too small would be suppose the interest groups, let's just take the teachers union, they can foresee that changing the time of the elections is going to undermine their power. They want to prevent it. Then those districts that actually are able to make the change. So what we're seeing here is just the effect of giving the treatment, basically reducing special interest power where they were already weakest to begin with. And it might be the case that if we could have done this in the districts that had the strongest degree of special interest influence, you see a much bigger, a change to the balance of power in those type of districts. That could be. On the other hand, you could say, well, when we look at for making the switch in electoral timing, it's just to save money on the administration of costs, because if you're holding this one election just for school districts one day of the year, you're running the whole electoral apparatus, and that's administratively costly. So you might worry that the districts that made the switch were the sort of they were otherwise the most cash-strapped districts who would have had to try to cut teacher salaries anyway for other reasons. So both of those reasons could push the estimates up or down. So we're working. I think we have two ideas. One is, I didn't mention this about the law. The state legislature said to the school districts, you may change the time of your election with the permission. Turns out that several districts, including big ones like LA, requested to change and were denied. So we might be able to use that as sort of a placebo test, right? They wanted to change but couldn't. And again, the general reason why they would be denied is the county would say, but the ballot is already too long. And they say, we don't need another set of offices already on the ballot. It's too long already. We don't want you to change. So we can look at that. We can also use an instrument, basically that we know basically how long the ballot is in each county. So if this is really what's going on, we could use that as an instrument to predict when you were able to change or not. The principle would be that would be a good instrument. We haven't done that. Okay, so that's kind of one problem that we're working on. Varying omitted variables. Time invariant, that is, things about the district that don't change over time are basically. I don't have an obvious story for that. Maybe if you thought property value, I was trying to think what to pay its teachers more or less, and one could be property values. If it's becoming more or less expensive to live in the district, it might have to affect teacher salaries. We can measure that. But we haven't done it yet. Okay, so our tentative conclusions. What we call the, because either of competition or because voters are just like non-voters. On policy, at least particularly the teacher, is, was it a big effect or a small effect? Should we care about this? Precisely zero, but we shouldn't care. So I think that when you think about whether it's a pretty big effect, it's two. So most of the years of post-treatment data. So even your district could time it can. With a union, just small would be to think about these results in elasticity. The change in voter turnout is very, very small. And for most, the sort of cause a doubling of that might affect turnout. I suspect there's nothing else we can imagine that would biggest possible intervention. Pretty small. All right. Effect is we can decide whether it's big or small. Alternatively, this timing tears his hair. All the elections on the same day, or should they all be on different days? And of course, when you start thinking about putting 4 years, but they could vote for 200. Amongst people who happen to be there. 20 offices each time. That comes from this. Of relying on schools, the very least I think holders held accountable. Depending on when you hold the politicians being held accountable to different interests. About relying on that's
So, which they've equalized their total amount is total amount of resources zero-sum game among the subset of I think teachers are being picked. Could be class.
mind the so that the California how to allocate that if you were to lower taxes, and two, interest groups the election. General people would tilt about. Either we could pay.
In that. Period.
3 or later, we may not.
Where's it coming from?
We haven't had a chance. Nice data. Comes. I don't know. Well, how old is? Well, because the pie is. Let me just get my notes.
Effects, did you include as one of your
Variables in one, the number of circuits.
might be in some